Which is why, when the anomaly appeared on Velthara's display 14 hours later, it took her a full 30 seconds to accept that what she was seeing was real. Commander. Something in her voice made Sevorith turn immediately. Not the word, the frequency of it. Velthara had a voice like still water. He had known her for 20 years, and he had never heard it carry that particular vibration before. What is it? She did not answer immediately. She was staring at her screen with an expression that, on a Vorkai face, translated roughly as careful disbelief. The look of someone who has checked something 3 times and is about to check it a 4th because the alternative is too strange to accept. Velthara. She looked up. Her skin had shifted, just slightly, just at the edges, from professional gray towards something with the faintest trace of pale amber. On a Vorkai, pale amber meant something specific. It meant unease. Commander, she said carefully, the signal archive has flagged something. An anomaly in the transmission record. She hesitated. It appears that approximately 12 of their years ago, well within our observation window, this civilization transmitted something unusual. Unusual how? She looked back at the screen, then back at him. It was addressed to us. Of SYMJHY. The silence on that bridge was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something shifting. The briefing room of the enduring patience was designed for function, not comfort. The Vorkai did not particularly value comfort in professional spaces. Comfort, in their cultural framework, was something that belonged to private life, to family quarters, to the long rest cycles that followed extended missions. In professional spaces, comfort was considered a form of distraction, a softening of the attention that rigorous work demanded. The briefing room, therefore, had no ornamentation, no temperature modulation beyond basic biological necessity, and the lighting was the flat, even gray-white that the Vorkai found most cognitively neutral. 7 senior officers sat around the hexagonal table. Sevorith stood at the head of it. Though head was a social designation, the table was geometrically equal on all sides, as Vorkai hierarchy was generally expressed through behavior rather than positioning. Velthara stood at the display surface, a wide, slightly curved screen built into the far wall, and prepared to present what the archive had found. She had spent the last 6 hours working with the translation AI, the cultural modeling team, and the signal analysts. She had not slept. The faint amber undertone in her skin had not faded. If anything, it had deepened slightly. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be unprofessional, but enough that the people in this room, who all knew how to read a colleague's skin the way humans read a face, could see it. They were all waiting. I will give you the context first, Velthara began, because without context, the transmission itself will not communicate its full significance. She brought up a star map on the display, the local galactic region, marked with Vorkai integration zones in soft blue, uncontacted civilizations in neutral gray, and the current target system marked in the pale gold they used for active operations. 12 of their years ago, this civilization, which refers to itself collectively by the name of its planet, Earth, successfully intercepted a fragment of compressed data from a Vorkai navigational relay beacon. She let that sit for a moment. Not deliberately. The intercept was, as far as our analysis can determine, accidental. A routine astronomical observation by one of their deep space monitoring programs. The fragment was small, less than 2% of a full relay packet, and it was encoded in a format that should have been, by any reasonable technical assessment, completely beyond their ability to decode. Should have been, said Senior Analyst Mordine, a heavy-set officer with a flat, wide eyes common to Vorkai from the northern coastal regions of the homeworld. Should have been, Velthara confirmed. They decoded it. Not completely. They recovered perhaps 40% of the data structure. But 40% was enough for them to understand several things. She advanced the display. First, that the signal was artificial. Second, that it was not of human origin. Third, and this is where it becomes remarkable, that it contained navigational data. Star maps, with their own system marked. The room was very quiet. They understood the maps, Sevorith said. It was not quite a question. Their mathematics, while limited in application, is structurally sophisticated. The underlying geometry of our navigational encoding is based on universal physical constants. Any civilization with sufficient mathematical development will eventually arrive at compatible frameworks. The humans did. It took them, according to our cultural archive, approximately 4 years from the initial intercept to achieve a functional partial decode. Velthera's voice remained steady. During that time, they did not announce the discovery publicly. It was handled by a small, apparently classified scientific group operating under governmental authority. They worked quietly. Sevorth noticed several of his officers shift at those words. The Vorkai admired strategic silence. It was one of their core cultural values. Hearing that this young, fragmented, apparently chaotic civilization had managed genuine strategic silence, had kept a secret of this magnitude contained for years, was, in itself, information. And then Velthera continued. 8 years ago, they composed a response. They used the navigational beacon frequency, which they had isolated from the fragment, and they transmitted a message, directed outward, in the general direction of the beacon's origin point. She paused. Which was not our current position. We had relocated the beacon by then, but they had transmitted anyway to where it had been a reasonable choice given their information. And they encoded the message in a format they clearly believed a technologically advanced civilization would be able to interpret. What format? Asked Mordine. Mathematical structure first, prime sequences, geometric progressions, universal constants, followed by a translation key, followed by their message in their most widely used language, with the translation key applied. Velthera looked at Sevorth directly. It is, I want to be clear, a genuinely competent piece of communication design for civilization at their technological level. And the signal archive caught it. It was in the archive, flagged as anomalous by the AI but not escalated to officer review because it was categorized as, she glanced at her notes, indigenous transmission, non-threatening, routine cultural output. The AI did not recognize the navigational frequency match because it was searching for active threats, not for evidence of prior contact awareness. There was a silence. Someone built the categorization filter too narrowly, Sevorth said. Yes. Velthera did not assign blame. She simply confirmed the fact. We have corrected it. What does the message say? Asked the youngest officer at the table. Navigation Second Arokeln, who was on his first integration mission and was very carefully maintaining a neutral expression that was not quite succeeding. Velthera looked at the wall display. I am going to read you the message, she said. In full. I want you to hear the complete text before we discuss it, because the meaning is not in any single section. The meaning is in the totality. She brought it up on screen. Of SYMJHY, here is what they had written to the stars. 8 years ago, from a small blue planet that did not yet know faster than light travel was theoretically possible. To whoever finds this, we know you are watching. We know what the navigational mark on your map means. We are not afraid, or rather, we are afraid, but we have decided that fear is not the most useful response available to us. We are writing this because we believe that any civilization advanced enough to have mapped our solar system and marked it in their navigation systems is advanced enough to read what we write next and take it seriously. We are a young species. We make a great many mistakes. We have spent considerable portions of our history hurting each other in ways that, if we are honest with ourselves, we are not entirely done with yet. We are not presenting ourselves as examples of peaceful perfection. We are presenting ourselves as what we are, complicated, contradictory, stubborn creatures who have been alive on this planet for a very short time and would very much like to continue. We do not know your intentions. We have considered many possibilities. We have discussed them, quietly in small rooms, among people who were selected because they could hold this information without destroying it. We considered the possibility that you intend trade. We considered the possibility that you intend something else. If you intend something else, we want you to know the following. We have been afraid before, many times, of each other, of our own weapons, of the future, of our own capacity for destruction. We have survived all of it, not cleanly, not without cost, but we have survived it. We have a habit of surviving things that seem unsurvivable. We do not say this as a threat. We say it as information, because we believe you value information. But here is what we actually want to say. The reason we built a transmitter capable of reaching your beacon frequency and spent 3 years figuring out how to encode this message properly. We are not asking for mercy. We are not begging. We are not negotiating from fear. We are asking for a conversation. We are saying, we know you are there. We know you have been watching. We are watching too, in the ways we are able to. And we would like, before anything else happens, to simply talk. Because we have found, in our short and complicated history, that most of the worst things that have ever happened to us happened because two groups of people were in the same space with conflicting needs, and neither one of them tried to speak first. We are trying to speak first. We understand if you do not answer. We understand if this changes nothing about whatever you intend to do. We wrote it anyway because it was the most honest thing we could do, and honesty is something we are still learning to be good at, but we are trying. Earth. Velthara stopped reading. The briefing room was silent for a long time. Sevorith stood very still. His skin, which had been the carefully maintained gray of professional composure for the entire briefing, had shifted, unmistakably, visibly, without his permission, to pale amber. There was a concept in Vorkai, strategic theory, called Velsherith. It translated, imperfectly, as the variable that changes the nature of the calculation. Not just a complication, not just an obstacle, something more fundamental, a factor whose presence meant that the original calculation was not merely incomplete but was, in a deep structural sense, wrong. Not wrong in its arithmetic, but wrong in its assumptions about what kind of problem was being solved. Vorkai's strategic training devoted significant time to recognizing Velsherith before it was too late. The historical cases were well documented. There had been a military engagement 400 years ago, in the early expansion period, where a Vorkai fleet had spent 3 years planning an integration operation only to discover, 2 days before deployment, that the target civilization had already begun integrating themselves into the Vorkai economic network through a series of independent trade contacts that the fleet commanders had classified as irrelevant background noise. The entire operation had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Not because the original plan was tactically flawed, but because the problem it was solving had quietly changed shape while the planners weren't looking. The message from Earth was Velsherith. Sevorith recognized it immediately. That was, he supposed, something that he recognized it immediately rather than spending weeks trying to fit the new information into the old framework. He had seen younger commanders do that, had watched them twist and compress contradicting data until it fit inside the model they had already built, because rebuilding the model was painful and expensive and felt like admitting failure. It was not admitting failure. It was how thinking was supposed to work. But it was uncomfortable. He let the discomfort happen. He stood at the viewport in his private quarters that night, the deep night of a ship's cycle, when most of the crew was in rest, and he looked at the pale blue light of Earth in the distance, and he thought, the model had assumed a civilization at this developmental stage would be operating entirely within its own frame of reference, absorbed in its internal conflicts, its resource competition, its political divisions. The model predicted a species in a particular psychological posture, essentially inward-facing, present but not looking outward, not watching, not specifically watching for something like us. The model had been wrong, not catastrophically wrong, not wrong about the technology level or the population or the resource distribution, wrong about the posture, wrong about where they were pointing their attention. And posture, Sevorith had learned over 40 years of integration work, mattered enormously. You could plan around a population that was looking in the wrong direction. You could not plan around one that was already looking directly at you, had been looking at you for 12 years, and had spent 8 of those years composing a letter. He thought about the letter. He had read it 5 times. Each time, he found something different in it, not because the words changed, but because he was reading with different parts of his attention. The first time, he had read it as a security analyst. What do they know? How much have they decoded? What operational risk does this represent? The second time, as a cultural anthropologist, what does this tell us about how they think? What values are embedded in the word choices? What assumptions about us are revealed in what they expect us to understand? The third time, and this was the one that stayed with him, he had read it as something he didn't have a professional category for. He had read it as a person. And what he found, reading it that way, was something he had not encountered in 43 integration operations. He found something that felt, to his surprise and considerable discomfort, like recognition. We have been afraid before. Many times. We are not asking for mercy. We are trying to speak first. The Vorkai had a concept, a very old concept, older than their current civilization, rooted in the pre-expansion philosophical texts that were considered classical reading, but not particularly relevant to modern strategic work, about what happened when two systems that were designed never to interact accidentally found themselves in alignment. It was considered a theoretical curiosity, not a practical concern. Savorath had always found theoretical curiosities more interesting than most of his colleagues did. He pulled up the Cultural Modeling Report again. Section 12. Psychological Profile of Dominant Earth Civilizations. He had read summaries before. Now he read the full text. All 140 pages of it. He read about the wars. The catastrophic, continent-spanning wars, not one but many. He read about the weapons humans had built, weapons of such indiscriminate destructive capacity that they had nearly ended their own civilization at least twice, weapons they had built themselves and then sat with for decades in a kind of horrified standoff, choosing every single day to not use them. He read about the diseases that had swept through their populations and the responses, the panicked responses, the insufficient responses, and then eventually the organized responses that came too late, and the lessons that were painfully extracted from the too lateness and applied going forward. He read about the small things, too. The songs. The stories they told about themselves. The recurring themes. And there were recurring themes, even across thousands of distinct cultural traditions, of people who had been beaten down finding a reason to stand up again. Not always victoriously. Sometimes they stood up and got beaten down again. They stood up anyway. We have a habit of surviving things that seem unsurvivable. He believed them, not because it was strategically useful to believe them, because the cultural record, for 100 years of broadcasted transmissions, backed it up at a sample size large enough to be statistically meaningful. These were not creatures that gave up easily. This was not a species that collapsed under pressure. They bent under pressure, sometimes catastrophically, but they had a deep, apparently genetic stubbornness about returning to shape afterward. He thought about the message again. We are asking for a conversation. He thought about the 43 integrations he had overseen. He thought about the 19 star systems in the Vorkai network and the dozens of civilizations currently operating within it, contributing their resources and expertise to the collective economic structure. He thought about how many of those civilizations had been given a choice. A real choice, not the kind of choice that was offered after integration was already complete, a ratification of something already done, but a genuine prior choice. He thought about the answer. The answer, if he was being honest, and he was here, alone in the dark with no professional performance required of him, was none. None of them had been given a genuine prior choice. He had never before found this troubling. The philosophy of Vorkai integration was that the choice was not offered because the offer itself would cause harm, would trigger exactly the kind of traumatic resistance that the silent approach was designed to prevent. You did not ask a creature's permission to remove a parasite from its bloodstream. The integration was good for the target civilization, ultimately. The data supported this. Civilizations in the Vorkai network had longer average lifespans, lower rates of self-destructive warfare, more stable resource distribution. He stopped. He sat with that argument. He had used that argument, or versions of it, many times. He had used it on himself, on younger officers who asked uncomfortable questions early in their careers. It was a real argument. The data was real. The outcomes were, by measurable standards, positive. But there was something in the message from Earth, in the specific words, "We are asking for a conversation," that made the argument feel different than it had ever felt before. Not wrong exactly. Not definitely wrong. But different. Smaller. Like a garment that had always fit perfectly and had, without warning, begun to feel tight. He called Velthra at the beginning of the next ship's day. She arrived in his office quickly. She had clearly not been fully asleep either. The amber in her skin had faded, but not entirely. "I want to convene an extended analysis session," he said. "Full senior staff. I want the cultural modeling team and the translation AI output reviewed at depth. And I want a specific question examined, a question that is not currently anywhere in our operational protocol." Velthara waited. Caro. He looked at her directly. I want to examine what happens if we respond. Velthara was quiet for 3 full seconds. That is not a protocol category, Commander, she said. No, he agreed. It is not. She looked at him for a long moment. The amber in her skin, he noticed, did not deepen. If anything, it shifted. Not toward the gray of professional neutrality, but toward something else. Something he did not have a precise word for. Something that was in the same family as curiosity. I will arrange the session, she said. The extended analysis session lasted 3 days. Not 3 hours. 3 full ship days, with rotating sleep breaks and a continuous thread of review, debate, and revision that moved through the senior staff in shifts like a relay, each group picking up the thread where the last had left it, adding new material, complicating settled conclusions. Sevorith was present for most of it. He slept twice, briefly, reluctantly, and returned each time to find that the conversation had moved in directions he had not predicted. What they were doing had no official name, because it had no official precedent. The closest operational category was pre-contact reassessment, which was a protocol that existed on paper and had technically never been invoked in the 400-year history of Vorkai expansion. It had been written by a philosopher-strategist named Vethanora, who had lived 3 centuries ago and whose work was respected but considered largely theoretical. Vethanora had argued, in a series of dense, carefully reasoned papers that most Vorkai strategic planners read once in their training, and then set aside, that there would eventually come a case in which a target civilization would demonstrate what she called Sharveth, the quality of self-aware becoming. Sharveth was not intelligence. Intelligence was easy to identify and did not, by itself, change the integration calculus. It was not technological sophistication either, or cultural complexity, both of which the Vorkai had encountered in abundance and integrated around without moral difficulty. Sharveth was something more specific. It was the demonstrated capacity for a civilization to understand its own situation from the outside, to look at itself and see not just what it was, but what it was in relation to something larger, to perceive the frame rather than just the picture inside it. The letter from Earth was, by any reasonable application of Vethanora's criteria, a demonstration of Sharveth. We know you are watching. Awareness of observation. We are not presenting ourselves as examples of peaceful perfection. Self-critical assessment, absence of self-serving distortion. We are trying to speak first. Strategic understanding of communication as preemptive relationship building. The cultural modeling team, when asked to formally assess the transmission against Sharveth criteria, returned a confidence rating of 87%. The senior analyst who delivered this rating looked uncomfortable doing so, in the way that someone looks uncomfortable delivering a result that is technically correct but practically inconvenient. What does the remaining 13% represent? Sevorith asked. The possibility, the analyst said carefully, that the message was a coincidental artifact, that the qualities we are reading as Sharveth are projections of our own interpretive framework onto what is actually a simpler and more reflexive communication. He paused. I want to be transparent that my team finds this alternative explanation unconvincing, but intellectual honesty requires including it. Noted, Sevorith said. Proceed with 87%. What this meant, what the invocation of Sharveth criteria meant, if the Vorkai chose to take Vethanora's philosophical framework seriously, was that the standard integration protocol was no longer applicable. Vethanora had been explicit about this. Her argument was not sentimental. She was not arguing that civilizations with Sharveth were morally superior or had more right to sovereignty than those without it. She was arguing something more structural, that a civilization with genuine self-aware relational capacity, when integrated without its knowledge or consent, would eventually, inevitably, arrive at the full understanding of what had been done to it, and that a civilization capable of Sharveth would not process this understanding the way less self-aware civilizations did. It would not simply produce diffuse cultural trauma or localized resistance. It would produce something more directed, more coherent, and potentially far more destabilizing to the network as a whole. She called this the return of the conversation that was never had. The Vorkai had dismissed this argument for 3 centuries as elegantly theoretical and practically irrelevant. No civilization had yet demonstrated Sharveth clearly enough to require the argument to be taken seriously. Until now. On the second day of the session, Velthera presented an analysis that Sevorith had not requested but that she had produced independently, which was itself somewhat unusual, and which told him something about where her thinking had gone. She had gone back through the cultural archive. All 400 years of Earth transmissions, not the summary statistics, but the actual content. She had built a search framework looking for specific thematic elements, acknowledgement of unknown observers, self-critical historical assessment, speculative reasoning about non-human intelligence, communication attempts directed outward. She had found more than anyone expected, not just the message. The message was the most explicit and directed example, but it was not, it turned out, an anomaly. It was more like a culmination. There were hundreds of years of fictional stories, novels, films, recorded performances, in which humans imagined exactly this scenario, a more powerful civilization watching, approaching, arriving. And a significant number of those stories, she had done a thematic analysis, did not end with victory or with defeat. They ended with conversation. With the discovery that the more powerful force had underestimated what the smaller one was, had failed to account for something essentially human, and had been changed by the encounter in ways neither side had expected. They have been practicing this, Velthera said. Not in a literal sense. But cognitively, philosophically, they have been running this scenario in their cultural imagination for generations. They have been thinking about what to say, how to say it, what it might mean. They wrote the letter, Mordine said slowly, because they had already, in some collective sense, written it 1,000 times before. Yes, Velthera said. That is precisely it. The room was quiet with the weight of that. On the third day, Sevorith made a decision. It was not a decision he made alone. That was not how Vorkai command structure worked at the senior level. He made it through a formal process of deliberative consensus that took most of the day and involved significant disagreement. Mordine argued against it. His argument was pragmatic and not without validity. Responding to the message, acknowledging the contact, would fundamentally alter the integration pathway. It would require escalation to the High Fleet Command, which would require justification, which would require invoking Bethanora's framework in an official capacity for the first time in Vorkai history. This would generate bureaucratic complexity, political argument, potential delays. The current mission timeline was sound. The integration model was solid. The pragmatic path was to continue as planned. Navigation Secondaro Keln, in a moment of junior officer courage that Sevorith noted carefully and filed away for future recognition, pointed out that the pragmatic path assumed the integration model was still the right model for this situation. And the 3-day analysis had raised genuine uncertainty about that. Pragmatism applied to the wrong problem was not actually pragmatic, it was just familiar. Mordine did not have a clean answer to this. The consensus, in the end, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. They would respond, not with force, not with a fleet approach, not with the slow, silent machinery of integration. With a letter. Of SYMJHY, Sevorith sat alone in his quarters that evening and thought about the 43 worlds. He thought about each of them. He did not often do this. There was no professional reason to do it, and professional people in his position generally did not spend their private hours cataloging the operations they had run like items in an inventory. It was considered, within the psychological culture of the Vorkai officer class, a sign of insufficient compartmentalization. He did it anyway. 43 worlds. He remembered the atmospheres, the colors of the skies, the particular qualities of light through different chemical compositions. He remembered the sounds of the civilizations, the samples the archive teams had collected, music, machinery, the ambient noise of populated cities from orbital distance. He remembered the specific challenges of each operation, the variables that had required creative solutions, the things that had gone almost wrong and the adjustments that had corrected them. He tried to remember the moment in each case when he had thought about the people on the ground. The individual people, not the population statistics, not the cultural models, but the actual individuals, whatever they looked like, whoever they were. He was having difficulty. He was not proud of this difficulty. He was also not, he decided, going to pretend it wasn't there. He thought about the letter writers. The small classified group, somewhere on Earth, who had spent years decoding a navigational signal they were never supposed to find, and then more years composing a careful, honest, surprisingly self-aware message to whoever was watching, whoever might be there, and had sent it out into the vast, indifferent dark of space without knowing if anyone would ever receive it. Knowing they might not. Sending it anyway. Because it was the most honest thing we could do. He thought about what it took to do that. Not technically. Technically, he understood the effort involved in the technical work. He thought about what it took psychologically. To sit with the knowledge that something enormous and unknown was watching you. To decide that the right response to that enormousness was not hiding, not screaming, not building more weapons, but writing a letter. A careful, honest, uncertain, fundamentally kind letter. He thought about whether the 43 worlds he had integrated, quietly, without their knowledge or consent, had contained people like that. He thought they probably had. He thought about that for a long time. The composition of the response took longer than the deliberation. This surprised some of the officers and did not surprise others. Velthera was not surprised. She had argued from the beginning that the response, if they decided to make one, would be the hardest part, not because of technical difficulty, but because of a problem that had no precise technical solution. What do you say to someone who has already said exactly the right thing? The Earth message had been, and the analysis team had confirmed this as a formal assessment, not merely an emotional impression, structurally complete. It had said what needed to be said, in the right order, without excess, without manipulation, without the kind of rhetorical performance that Vorkai communication experts had learned to identify and discount in hundreds of civilizations. It was just honest. It was just a true account of a situation and a genuine request. The Vorkai response would be read against it, measured against it. Whatever they wrote, the humans, or at least the small group of humans who had written the original, would read the response and evaluate it not just for information but for quality. For whether the beings who sent it were as capable of honesty as they had asked the humans to be. This was uncomfortable in a way that was hard to articulate, but impossible to dismiss. Velthera led the composition team. She selected 6 people from across the ship's departments, not just communication specialists, but a structural engineer, a biologist, the ship's philosophical officer, a position that most non-Vorkai civilizations found puzzling when they learned it existed, and Arokelm, the young navigation officer, who had not been selected for seniority, but because, of all the people on the ship, he seemed the most likely to notice when something they wrote did not sound like a real thing a real being would say. They spent 2 days on it. 37 drafts. Savorath reviewed each draft without comment until the 31st, at which point he asked to speak with Velthera alone. "We keep writing around the important thing," he said. She set down the draft she was holding. "Yes. We keep explaining our technology, our structure, our network. We keep providing information as if that is what was asked for." "Yes." The message did not primarily ask for information, he said. It asked for acknowledgement. It asked for, he searched for the right word, presence. The confirmation that there was someone there, on the other side, who had heard them. Velthera was quiet for a moment. The philosophical officer said something similar. She said, "We keep trying to answer a diplomatic communique when what we received was closer to," she hesitated over the translation, "something they call a letter in a bottle. An object cast into uncertainty, not expecting a specific return but hoping for contact. What does that require in response?" She said, "Something real." Velthera picked up a data glass. She said the draft that comes closest is number 28, but it is still too formal. "Show me." He read number 28. It was closer than the others. But Velthera was right. There was a quality of formal performance in it, a Vorkai tendency towards structured presentation that, when he read it imagining himself as the person on Earth who had written the original message, felt like receiving a legal document when you had sent a personal letter. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Let me write a section." Velthera looked at him. In 20 years, Savorath had never personally written communication copy. He was a strategic commander. He planned operations, managed officers, made decisions. He did not write letters. "All right," she said. He wrote for 4 hours. He did not show it to anyone until it was finished. When he was done, he sent it to Velthera without a cover note. She read it. She read it twice. Then she sent it to the full composition team without comment, except for a single notation at the top of the document that simply said, "This is the one." The response, in final form, was not long. The Earth message had not been long, and matching its length felt important, not for strategic reasons, but because the length of something communicates as much as its content. A short message says, "I read you carefully. I understood you. This required attention, not volume." It read, in translation, to Earth, "We received your message. We want to say that clearly and directly before anything else, because we understand that you sent it without knowing if anyone would ever hear it, and the uncertainty of that must have had a particular weight. Someone heard it. We are the Vorkai. We have been present in this region of space for several of your years. We have been studying your world in ways that, as your message demonstrated, you had already partially understood. We will not pretend otherwise. You did not ask us to pretend, and we find that we do not want to." Your message contained a line, "We are trying to speak first. We have spent considerable time, more than our standard operational structure would consider appropriate, thinking about that line. We are, as a civilization, not accustomed to being spoken to first. We have developed systems specifically designed to prevent it. This is not something we have ever said to any civilization we have encountered. We are saying it to you because your message asked for honesty and because we believe, after significant internal examination, that honesty is what this particular situation requires. You asked for a conversation. We are not entirely certain what a conversation between our two civilizations looks like, or whether our operational structures, which are substantial and complex and not easily redirected, can accommodate something as open-ended as a genuine conversation. We are being honest about this uncertainty because you were honest about yours. What we can tell you is this: we have read what you wrote. We have read it many times, and it has changed the nature of the question we are asking ourselves about your world. We cannot yet tell you what it has changed it to, but we can tell you that it has changed. We are asking for time, a specific amount of time, which we will tell you, 2 of your years, to bring this situation to our wider governing structure and advocate for a different kind of process than the one we arrived here to execute. We cannot promise the outcome. We can promise that the advocacy will be genuine. In the meantime, we are here. You are there. We are aware of each other. That is, we believe, where conversations begin. Vorkai's 7th Cartographic Fleet. Commander Sevorith, aboard the Enduring Patience. The message was encoded at the navigational beacon frequency, directed toward Earth's primary listening arrays, and transmitted on the first morning of the 4th day following the initial discovery. Then they waited. Caro, and in the silence that followed the transmission, the bridge of the Enduring Patience was very still. Not the silence of emptiness. Not the silence of things proceeding routinely. The silence of something waiting to become what it was going to be. Aro Keln was at his navigation station. He had not been asked to stay. He had simply not left. Sevorith noticed this but said nothing. Velthara stood at the communications array, watching the signal output with the focused attention of someone who understood that what they were watching was, in the deep sense, irreversible. The message was already traveling outward. Whatever happened next, Earth received it or didn't. The response was what they hoped, or something else. The High Fleet Command approved the new process or overruled it. The 2-year window became a genuine negotiation or became nothing. Whatever happened next, this had already happened. The conversation had been offered. Sevorith stood at the viewport and watched the blue-white planet turn slowly in the dark. He thought about 43 worlds. He thought about Velshareth, the variable that changes the nature of the calculation. He thought about what it meant that he was standing here, on a ship that had arrived for one purpose and found itself, through the agency of a letter written by people who did not know they were being watched, pursuing something entirely different. Something that did not have a name in the current operational protocol. Something that perhaps, eventually would. 11 days. That was how long it took. The Vorkai had estimated it would take between 30 and 90 days for any response, if a response came at all. The transmission would need to reach Earth's monitoring arrays, be flagged as anomalous. There were no humans currently monitoring the navigational beacon frequency continuously. They would have set up automated detection, probably, then be escalated to the small classified group, deciphered using the translation key they had already developed from the fragment decode years before, analyzed, and then deliberated over. Deliberation took time. Human political processes, as observed in the archive, were not fast. 11 days. Velthera flagged the incoming signal at 0340 ship time. Deep in the rest cycle, the ship operating on minimal watch staff. She did not escalate it through automated protocol. She walked down the corridor to Sevorth's quarters and knocked twice on the physical door panel. He was awake within seconds. She suspected he had not been deeply asleep. "Response received?" he asked through the panel. "Yes," she said. He opened the door. He was dressed. She suspected he had been sitting in the dark, waiting, for longer than he would officially admit. They walked to the communications suite together. The watch officer, a junior analyst named Sevmore, who was young enough that the amber in his skin was not fully under control and who appeared to be experiencing mild, genuine excitement, gave them the room with appropriate professional discretion. The response had come on the same frequency they had used. The encoding followed the exact protocol from Earth's original message, the mathematical structure, the translation key, then the language content. They had received it. They had decoded it without difficulty. They had responded in kind. Caro. Velthera loaded the response on the display. They read it together. To the Vorkai's 7th Cartographic Fleet and Commander Sevorth of the Enduring Patience. We received your message. We want to say that we read your first lines several times. We received your message. You may not be aware of this, but in our culture, there is a kind of writing called correspondence. Letters sent between people who care about each other, sometimes across great distances, and it is considered correct form to begin such a letter by confirming receipt. Not because the sender doesn't know their letter arrived, but because saying I received it means I am here. I am paying attention. What you sent mattered enough to reach me. We're not sure if you intended that. If you did, it was a kind thing. If you didn't, we are telling you anyway because you should know the effect it had. You said our message changed the nature of the question you were asking about our world. You said you could not yet tell us what it changed it to. We understand this. Many of the most important changes we have made, as individuals, as nations, as a species, have begun exactly that way. As an alteration of a question, before the new question had a clear answer. The change in the question is where the change begins. You asked for 2 years. We want to tell you that among the people in this room, there are 11 of us, sitting around a table in a building that most of our world does not know exists, in a city we will not name, in a country we will not name. There is significant disagreement about how to respond to that request. Some of us want to give you the 2 years without conditions. Some of us believe conditions are necessary. Some of us are afraid, in ways we are trying to be honest about, that 2 years is time in which things could happen that are not reversible. We have decided to tell you about the disagreement directly, because your message told us you were uncertain and did not hide it. We thought we should match that. Here is what we have agreed on. We will give you the 2 years. Not without conditions. We are a suspicious species, and pretending we are not would be dishonest, and you asked for honesty. The condition is this. Continued communication. Not negotiation yet, not terms, not formal process. Just continued communication. Letters, if that is the right word. So that the 2 years is not silence on our end and process on yours, but something that is happening between us rather than to us. We do not know what you came here to do. We have ideas. We have read your first message carefully, and we are not naive about what it implies. But we have decided, and this was not a unanimous decision, and we are telling you that too, that we would rather know what comes next than not know. We would rather be in the conversation than outside it. We are afraid. We are choosing to be here anyway. There are 11 of us in this room. We do not represent our entire world. We want to be honest about that because our world is 8 billion people who have no idea this conversation is happening, and we feel the weight of that. We are doing our best. Please do the same. The Earth Correspondence Group. Sevorth finished reading. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, The Earth Correspondence Group. Yes, Velthera said. They named themselves. They did. He read the letter again. Slower this time. We are afraid. We are choosing to be here, anyway. He thought about the 43 worlds again. He had been thinking about them a lot lately. He thought about whether any of them, in any of the archives, in any of the centuries of data, had ever expressed this particular quality with this particular clarity, not bravery as the absence of fear, but bravery as the presence of fear and the decision to proceed regardless. He thought the answer was probably yes, somewhere in 43 worlds of human data. He thought it probably existed. He thought about the fact that he had never been in a position to read it before. Draft a response, he said. Not me this time. I think the composition team can carry this one. But tell them, match the register. They wrote to us as people. We write back as people. Every time. Velthera nodded. She was already moving toward the door. Velthera.
She stopped.
The condition they named, he said. Continued communication.
He paused.
I think it is a good condition. She looked at him for a moment. The gray of her professional composure had shifted, he noticed, just slightly, just at the edges, not toward amber this time, but toward something else. Something he recognized from the philosophical texts, from the old pre-expansion vocabulary, from a word that was not used often in modern professional life. Something adjacent to hope. I think so too, Commander, she said. The Earth Correspondence Group had no official name until they put it in the letter. Dr. Maya Chun had suggested it, half-joking in the way she suggested most things, during the 3 days of argument and counter-argument and silences that had followed the arrival of the Vorkai transmission. She was a linguist and a specialist in non-human communication theory, which was an academic field that, until 12 years ago, had been largely theoretical in the most literal possible sense. She had a habit of naming things. She found that unnamed things had a tendency to behave as if they didn't fully exist, which she considered an epistemological problem as much as a practical one. We should call ourselves something, she had said, somewhere around hour 40 of the session, when everyone was exhausted and the disagreements had ground from sharp-edged to dull and heavy. Even if it's just among ourselves. The group is too passive. We're doing something. We should have a name for the thing we're doing. General Marcus Webb, who was the most senior military figure in the room, and who had the kind of face that had spent 40 years communicating precisely nothing so that the face itself had become a kind of communication, controlled blankness as active statement, had looked at her without expression for a moment, and then said, Fine. Correspondence Group. Earth Correspondence Group, she had said. And it had stuck. There were 11 of them. 3 scientists, Maya, a physicist named Dr. Ravi Patel, and Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a cognitive scientist whose specific expertise in how minds constructed models of other minds had made her the most useful person in the room when it came to interpreting the Vorkai messages. 3 government officials, General Webb, a State Department senior official named Director, and Halverson, who had the kind of calm that was either genuine or so deeply practiced it had become genuine, and a National Security Council representative named Thomas Reyes, who had been assigned to the group because his clearance was high enough and who had spent much of the first week looking as though he was waiting for someone to tell him it was a drill. 2 intelligence analysts, both anonymous, both very good at sitting still, and very slow to say anything but precise when they did. A technical expert named Dr. James Okafor, who had been part of the original Decode team 12 years ago, and was now the person in the room who understood the Vorkai signal most deeply at a structural level. A diplomatic protocol specialist named Dr. Lena Brandt, who had studied the theory of first contact communication for 30 years, and was now experiencing the full weight of that preparation meeting the reality it had been preparing for. And Dr. Frank Summers, an anthropologist and historian whose specific job, self-assigned, was to keep reminding everyone in the room that the decisions they were making would eventually become history and should be made accordingly. They had been meeting in a building in an undisclosed location for 8 days when the Vorkai response arrived. The original intercept, 12 years ago, had happened at a different facility. The response team had been assembled 6 years ago, when the message was nearly ready and the question of what to do, if anything came back, needed to be at least theoretically structured. The 11 of them had been meeting, irregularly, twice a year, to maintain operational readiness for a scenario that most of them half-believed would never actually activate. And then it had activated. Maya had read the Vorkai response 3 times before she said anything. The room had read it together, then in individual silence, and then there had been a long period where no one spoke. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who had nothing to say, but the full silence of people who had too much to say and were trying to sort it into the right order. Thomas Reyes spoke first, which surprised everyone, because he had been the quietest person in the room for 8 days. They said, "We cannot yet tell you what it has changed it to, but we can tell you that it has changed." He looked around the table. Does that read to anyone else as someone who is having a harder time with this than they expected? Several people looked at each other. Yes, Dr. Okonkwo said. That is exactly what it reads as. She leaned forward. I want to talk about the cognitive architecture of this message, because I think it matters. Whoever composed this, and I believe it was composed by an individual, not a committee, the voice is too consistent for a committee draft, is an active processing of a significant cognitive shift. The language is careful in a way that careful language is careful when the person using it is trying to be precise about something genuinely uncertain, not uncertain as performance. What's the significance of that? Webb asked. It means, Okonkwo said, that we are corresponding with at least one individual on that ship who is not certain about what they are doing.
Who is doing it anyway?
Who wants us to know both things. The room was quiet. That's... Maya started, then stopped. That's what? Webb said. That's not what I expected them to be like, she said simply. The disagreement about conditions had been genuine. Frank Summers had argued against any conditions. His historical argument was that conditions in early contact situations frequently became the seeds of later conflict, that the request itself for conditions communicated distrust that would be remembered. And Halverson had argued, with the steady patience of someone who had spent a career navigating exactly this kind of disagreement, that communicating distrust was not inherently bad, it was honest, and the initial message had been premised on honesty. The intelligence analysts had said very little, but both nodded when Halverson spoke. The condition that emerged, continued communication, was a compromise that, like most good compromises, initially satisfied no one completely and eventually seemed right to almost everyone. The Vorkai did not conquer worlds the way old stories described conquerors. They did not arrive with fire. They did not send armies first. They did not broadcast threats across open frequencies or demand surrender from trembling populations who had never seen a ship larger than their moon.
No.
The Vorkai arrived with silence. Total, surgical, absolute silence. Their method was elegant in the way that a scalpel is elegant, not because it is beautiful but because it wastes nothing. First, their long-range cartographers would spend decades studying a target world from distances so vast that even the most advanced civilizations they had ever encountered had never detected the observation probes. The probes were smaller than a grain of sand, coated in a material that absorbed every known form of electromagnetic radiation, and they drifted through space on gravitational currents rather than propulsion. No heat signature, no emission trail, nothing to detect, nothing to fear. The Vorkai had developed this technology not out of malice, but out of philosophy. Their entire civilization was built on a concept that had no perfect translation in any of the 47 languages they had catalogued across the galaxy. The closest approximation, if you forced it through a linguistic filter and accepted that something essential would be lost, was something like, the most honorable consumption is the one the consumed never knew was happening.
It was not cruelty.
It was, in their minds, mercy. They had observed civilizations that resisted. They had seen the damage that resistance caused, the generations of trauma, the ecological collapse, the psychological fracture that ran through a species for centuries after a violent conquest. The Vorkai found this wasteful. A damaged civilization was a less productive one. A traumatized population produced less, created less, contributed less to the vast interstellar economy that the Vorkai had spent 4,000 years carefully assembling across 19 star systems. So they studied first. Always studied first. They learned everything. The languages, the resource distribution, the political fault lines, the psychological pressure points. They learned what a civilization feared, what it loved, what it believed happened after death, what songs it sang to its children before sleep. And then, only then, when they understood their target with a completeness that the target could never understand itself, they moved. Not with violence. With inevitability. Commander Sevorith stood at the primary observation deck of the Enduring Patience, the flagship of the 7th Cartographic Fleet, and looked at the blue-white planet rotating slowly in the view screen before him. It was, by any measurable standard, unremarkable. Slightly larger than the Vorkai homeworld. One large moon, tidally locked. 71% surface water. A nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere that suggested complex biological life. Moderate axial tilt producing seasonal variation. Single star system. Stable main sequence. Low coronal activity. Nothing special. He had seen 43 worlds that matched this basic profile. He had personally overseen the quiet integration of 11 of them. The process, by now, felt almost routine. Not in a careless way, but in the way that a master craftsman's hands move through familiar motions without requiring conscious thought. Competence so deep it had become instinct. Sevorth was not arrogant. That was important to understand about him, because what came later could be misread as arrogance in retrospect. He was not arrogant. He was simply experienced. There is a difference, though it is a difference that only becomes visible under pressure. He reviewed the cartographic report on his data glass, a thin, curved screen that wrapped around his upper left arm, one of the 4 arms the Vorkai possessed, with joints that bent in directions humans would find anatomically implausible. His skin, like all Vorkai, was a deep bioluminescent gray that shifted subtly in color when he experienced strong emotion, a physiological feature the Vorkai had long ago learned to control in professional settings, the way a human might learn to control the expression on their face. Right now, his skin was the calm, steady gray of routine assessment. He read the summary statistics. Population, approximately 8 billion. Technology level, early spacefaring. They had reached their moon, placed mechanical instruments on nearby planets, and launched a small number of objects beyond their solar system, but they had not yet achieved faster-than-light travel or even conceived of it in workable theoretical terms. Communication systems, electromagnetic, radio frequency, digital. Social structure, fragmented nation-states with emerging global coordination bodies. Dominant biological form, bilateral symmetry, bipedal, for limbs, soft tissue exterior. Soft tissue exterior. Sevorth allowed himself a small, private thought, not cruelty, simply observation, that the galaxy seemed endlessly fond of producing bipedal soft tissue creatures. He had encountered 7 species matching that description. They all seemed to arrive at approximately the same technological level before either destroying themselves or being integrated. It was, he supposed, a convergent evolutionary pathway. Efficient, apparently. He set the data glass down and turned to his second-in-command, Velthra, who stood at the communications array with her characteristic stillness. Velthra was younger than Sevorth by about 60 years, which in Vorkai terms meant she was still in what they considered early professional maturity, experienced enough to be trusted, young enough to still find certain things surprising.
Velthra, he said.
Timeline for the soft approach. She consulted her own display, without looking up. Cartographic analysis is complete. Cultural modeling is 94% finished. We project full integration readiness in approximately 18 of their planetary rotations around their star. She paused. Roughly 18 of what they call years. 18 years. Sevorth nodded slowly. Standard. He turned back to the view screen. Begin passive signal archiving. I want everything they have transmitted in the last 200 of their years cataloged and processed. Already underway, Commander. Good. The enduring patience had been in position, at the very edge of the solar system, behind the electromagnetic shadow of the outermost gas giant, for 3 of their years already. The signal archive was vast. Billions of transmissions, radio programs, television broadcasts, military communications, scientific data, personal messages bounced between satellites. The Vorkai's translation AI had already built a comprehensive working model of the dominant languages. They knew what these people ate for breakfast. They knew what kept them awake at night. They knew the names of the things these people were afraid of. Everything was proceeding exactly as it always did. HFY and HFY, Lena Brandt, the protocol specialist, had made the argument that finally moved the room. She had said, "In every historical account of first contact scenarios that we have constructed theoretically, The thing we most consistently identified as the point of failure was the moment when one party stopped communicating with the other and began communicating at them. We are being offered 2 years. If those 2 years are silence for us and process for them, then we have given up the thing that makes us a party to this rather than a subject of it. The condition is not distrust. The condition is presence. We are saying, we are here, we will remain here, we will keep talking, and that means this happens between us. The room had agreed. Ravi Patel, who had not spoken much during the 8 days and who had the slightly abstracted quality of a man whose mind was running large calculations in a background process while his face participated in meetings, cornered Maya after the response was sent. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. The line in their message, "We have developed systems specifically designed to prevent being spoken to first." He looked at his notes. Do you think they meant that literally? Systems. Actual engineered systems. Almost certainly, Maya said. So they designed, he said slowly, an entire approach to encountering other civilizations specifically structured so that those civilizations would never do what we did. Yes. And then we did it anyway. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The message we sent, he said. In the years before we sent it, we were transmitting on their navigation frequency. We were transmitting into a specific part of space, toward the source of a signal that was not ours. We were doing something that, from their perspective, should have been technically impossible for us. That's right. He looked at her. We broke their model, he said. Not their technology. Their model. Their entire framework for how this kind of encounter is supposed to go. I know, Maya said. And they told us that, he said, in a response letter. That is either a remarkable act of intellectual honesty or, he paused, or they're telling us because they think we should understand what we're dealing with. Not as a warning, as respect. Maya thought about that for a long moment. Maybe both, she said. Maybe those aren't different. General Webb found her alone that evening, sitting by the single narrow window that looked out on a mostly dark landscape. He sat down next to her without ceremony, which was his way. How are you doing? He said. It was such a simple question. She almost laughed. I'm a linguist who spent 30 years studying non-human communication theory, she said. And now I'm in an actual correspondence with a non-human intelligence. So I am either the most professionally fulfilled person alive right now, or I'm having some kind of elaborate hallucination. Results so far point to the former, Webb said. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Marcus. The 8 billion people. I know. We are 11 people in a room corresponding with an alien fleet on behalf of 8 billion people who have no idea. I know. That's a lot. Webb was quiet for a while. He had the gift that certain people who had spent long careers in impossible situations had, of being comfortable with the reality of impossible situations without minimizing them. He did not tell her it would be fine. He did not tell her the wait wasn't real. What's the alternative? He said finally. Tell people. And then, she knew the answer. She had thought about the answer many times. The answer was chaos, probably. Not bad chaos necessarily, not permanent chaos, but immediate chaos of a kind that would almost certainly collapse the careful, fragile thing they were building with these letters, the specific quality of honest, careful, human-scaled communication they had managed to establish, under the weight of 8 billion voices with 8 billion different ideas about what to do. Maybe eventually the world would need to know, and could handle knowing. Not yet. I know, she said. Webb stood up. We're doing the right thing, he said. I know that too, she said. That doesn't make it lighter. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He left. Maya sat by the window and thought about conversations. About the extraordinary, dangerous, quietly miraculous fact that a letter she had helped write, in a building no one knew existed, to a ship no one knew was there, had been received by a commander who had told her, in plain and honest language, that it had changed something. She did not know what it had changed it to. She was choosing to be here, anyway. They wrote to each other across the dark. Not through ambassadors, not through channels, not through the formal architecture of interstellar, protocol. They wrote letters. Real ones, in the sense that they were composed by individuals speaking genuinely and read by individuals who responded genuinely, back and forth across the electromagnetic silence of space, with a transmission delay that varied between 40 minutes and 2 hours depending on orbital geometry, and never quite let either side forget the physical reality of the distance between them. The letters accumulated. 73 of them over the 2 years, some short, some long, some focused on specific questions, some wide and exploratory, covering ground that neither side had planned to cover when they sat down to write. It was, everyone involved later agreed, the strangest and most important correspondence in the history of either civilization. The third letter from Earth contained a question that Sevorith had not expected. Dr. Maya Chin. She had begun signing her name to letters, which the composition team had noted with interest and then adopted as practice on the Vorkai side, Veltharos signing hers. Aro Keln eventually signing his, had asked, "Can you tell us about the other civilizations you have encountered? Not details that compromise anyone's privacy or security. We understand you may have obligations there. But we find ourselves thinking about you not as an isolated presence but as part of something larger, and we would like to understand the shape of that larger thing." Sevorith had sat with this question for 2 days before writing back. The response he sent was 4 pages long, longer than any previous letter. He described the Vorkai network, not its strategic structure, not its resource economics, but its shape. The quality of what it felt like, from inside, to be part of something that spanned 19 star systems and contained dozens of distinct civilizations all going about their existence in their own ways while being connected by trade, by the slow exchange of knowledge, by the occasional friction that arose when different cultural frameworks came into contact. He described specific things, a musical tradition from one civilization that had spread through the network and been adopted, transformed, and returned in new forms. A mathematical technique developed by another civilization that had, when shared, solved a problem Vorkai engineers had been working on for 200 years. The particular kind of complexity that arose when beings who perceived time differently were trying to agree on a contract. He had not written like this before. It was not his professional mode. But the question had been genuine, and the answer wanted to be genuine, and genuineness, he was finding, had a way of expanding into whatever space was available to it. Maya's response had started. "Reading your letter, I found myself thinking about something we call diaspora, the experience of different cultures spreading, mixing, transforming, coming back to themselves changed. You described something that sounds like a very old, very complex version of this. We have been trying to build something like what you described, on a much smaller scale, across a single planet, and we are still not very good at it. What you're describing sounds like something that took a long time to get wrong before you started getting it right." Sevorith had read that last line several times. Getting wrong before getting it right. He had written back. For 100 years. And we are, in ways that the current conversation is helping me see more clearly, possibly still getting some of it wrong. Velthara's correspondence with Dr. Okonkwo had taken on its own character, more technical, more precise. 2 minds that shared a particular kind of rigor working through the problem of mutual comprehension from the inside out. Okonkwo had asked, in her 4th letter, about Vorkai emotional physiology. Not in a clinical way, she was too skilled for that, but through a specific question. "You mentioned that bioluminescent skin shifts communicate emotional states. I am curious. Is this considered private information? In many human cultures, strong emotional display is context-dependent, appropriate in some situations, inappropriate in others. I ask because I want to understand whether you are sharing something with us in these letters that you would not normally share, and if so, what that means." Velthara had found this question unexpectedly moving. She had written back. "In professional contexts, Vorkai learned to maintain skin neutrality, the way you have described learning to manage facial expression. It is considered a mark of competence. What you are asking is whether corresponding with you has involved a kind of emotional transparency that is unusual for us in a professional context. The honest answer is yes. I have discussed this with Commander Sevorith, and he agrees that these letters have a quality that is different from our professional norm, not less rigorous but more present, I suppose. More present. We think this is appropriate to the situation. We find ourselves less certain than usual about whether our professional norms are well suited to what this situation is." Okonkwo had replied, "I think that is one of the most significant things you have told us so far. Not the content of it, but the fact that you are willing to say it. The 15th letter from the Vorkai side was written by Aro Kelm. This had not been planned. He had appeared in Velthra's office one evening, data glass in hand, and said, with the directness of the young, that he had written something and would like to send it if it was considered appropriate. It was a letter to Maya Chin specifically, addressed to her by name because she had mentioned in a letter that she had been a student once, studying communication theory with no certainty that it would ever be practical, and he had recognized something in that. He wrote, I am the youngest officer on this ship. I was assigned to this mission because I am a navigation specialist, and we needed one, not for any strategic significance. I have been sitting at the edge of every meeting, listening to people much older and more experienced than me decide things, and there is a word in our language, sharveloth, which does not translate neatly, but it means something like, deeply awake to the significance of a moment that is larger than your ability to fully comprehend it. I have been sharveloth for 2 years. I wanted to tell someone. I thought you might understand. Maya's response to Aro Kelm had made him read it 3 times in the corridor outside the communication suite before he trusted himself to go back inside. She had written, the word you gave me, Sharveloth, I am going to carry it for the rest of my life. We do not have a precise equivalent, and we should.
Yes.
I understand exactly. The hard conversation happened in month 14. It had been approaching for a while. Both sides had been circling it, the shape of it visible in peripheral vision, neither side looking directly at it, until the 15th letter from the Vorkai side, not Aro Kelm's, a later one from Sevorith, made the circle tighter. He had written, I need to discuss with you the nature of what brought us here. Not as a confession, we are not certain we owe you that, and we are not certain you want it framed that way, but as information that I believe you partly have, and that I think should be fully explicit between us before the 2 years ends. We came to your solar system as part of an integration operation. We can explain what that means in full, if you want the full explanation. The short version is, we came to incorporate your world into our network in a way that you would not have been aware of until the process was already largely complete. This is what we do. It is what we have done 43 times. He had paused there in the letter and then continued, your message changed the operation. I want to be honest about the mechanism of that change, because there is a version of this that is flattering to us, that we recognized your worth, that we made a generous and enlightened choice, and I do not believe that version is accurate. The more accurate version is that your message broke a model. It did something our systems were not designed to accommodate. And in the space that opened up, several of us, particularly myself, had thoughts that we had not previously made room for. I do not know if this makes what we were doing better or worse. I know it makes it true. The Earth Correspondence Group had needed a week with that letter. General Webb had been very quiet for most of the week. On the 4th day, he said, we already knew. Not in exact terms, but we knew the shape of it. We sent the message anyway. Does that matter? Thomas Reyes asked. Yes, Webb said. I think it does. He looked around the table. I think it matters that we knew the shape of it and chose conversation. I think it matters that they knew we knew and told us the truth anyway. I think both of those things are what we actually want to be talking about when we respond. Frank Summers, the historian, had said quietly, this is the moment that people will want to understand years from now. This exact moment. How we respond here determines what kind of story this is. Maya had written the response. She had asked for the room, and then the building, and then sat alone for 6 hours, and then written it. Of SYMJHY, she had written, thank you for telling us the complete truth. We are not going to pretend it isn't difficult. Some of us are angry. Some of us are frightened. Some of us are, and this will perhaps surprise you, grateful. Not for what was planned. For what happened instead. For the fact that something in the machinery of what you described created space for someone to ask a different question. We are not in a position to speak for the 8 billion. We are in a position to speak for 11 people in a room who chose to be here, who wrote a letter into the dark knowing the shape of what might be watching, and who are still here, still in this conversation, still choosing it. We would like to continue choosing it. We have a question. What are you going to say to the High Fleet Command? The enduring patience had been in this solar system for 4 years and 3 months when Sevorith prepared his formal submission to the High Fleet Command. By Vorkai bureaucratic standard, this was already a significant overage. Standard integration missions ran between 2 and 3 years from final deployment to completion of first-phase integration. 4+ years, with no integration occurring, with a mission in an entirely unprecedented relational status that had no category in any official protocol document, was the kind of operational deviation that generated significant institutional attention. The attention had been, over the past 2 years, measured and concerned rather than hostile. Sevorith was a highly regarded commander. Velthara had quietly ensured that a carefully curated selection of the correspondence, enough to demonstrate the nature and quality of what was occurring, not so much that it overwhelmed institutional capacity for novel information, had been transmitted to senior command through appropriate channels. There had been no order to abort, no directive to return to standard operations. There had been inquiries, carefully worded, and Sevorith's responses had been careful in return. But the 2-year window was closing. A formal position was required. He spent 3 weeks preparing the submission. The final document was 47 pages long, the most formal, carefully constructed piece of writing he had produced in his career. It drew on Vethanora's philosophical framework, on the cultural analysis data, on the specific evidence of Sharveth, on the documented record of the correspondence, on the historical outcomes of all 43 previous integration operations, on the theoretical literature. Sevorith had become considerably more familiar with Vorkai philosophical literature over the past 2 years than he had ever been before, about the conditions under which integration produced the most stable long-term outcomes. The formal argument was that the Earth situation represents an unprecedented case that falls outside the applicable standard protocol, that the correct response to an unprecedented case is the creation of new protocol rather than the forced application of an inadequate existing one, that the specific qualities demonstrated by the Earth correspondence group, particularly the Sharveth indicators, make standard integration not merely unnecessary but actively counterproductive to long-term network stability, and that the 2 years of correspondence have created the foundation for a genuinely novel relational approach that the network has, in 400 years, not previously explored. He argued, in plain language, for something that had no official name. He argued for asking first, for going to Earth not as integrators but as the people who had been writing letters for 2 years, who knew about 11 people in a room, who knew about Sharveloth and letters in bottles, and the particular quality of someone who was afraid and choosing to be there anyway. He argued for landing on the ground, with full transparency about what they were, what they had come to do, and what they were no longer doing, and asking in person with full information available whether the Earth Correspondence Group and the civilization they represented wanted to be part of something larger. He filed the submission and then went to stand at the viewport and waited for his skin to stop doing the thing it was doing. It took a while. The response from the High Fleet Command arrived in 17 days, faster than expected. High Fleet Strategic Director Omithvel was an administrator Sevorith had dealt with twice before in his career. She was meticulous, cautious, politically skilled, and not particularly given to unconventional positions. She was the kind of institutional figure who had reached her position by being reliably right about what the institution needed rather than by being visionary. This was, in Sevorith's experience, not a disqualification for making good decisions in novel situations. Sometimes the reliably right approach was to recognize that a novel situation required novel handling, and the skill was in seeing that clearly rather than in having the novel idea. Her response was, "Submission reviewed. Your documentation of the Sharveth qualification is the most thorough application of Vethanora's framework in the historical record and constitutes, on its own, a significant academic contribution regardless of operational outcome. We are convening an extended strategic review. You are authorized to extend the current status quo for an additional 6 months, pending review outcome. You are further authorized, upon review conclusion, to proceed with whatever approach the review recommends. No preemptive limitation will be placed on the scope of options under consideration." Then, at the very end, in a postscript that was not formatted as official correspondence and which Sevorith read twice to make sure he was parsing the tone correctly. "Commander, I read the full correspondence record. All 73 letters.
I want you to know that.
I thought it warranted saying." He told Maya in the next letter. Not the full text of the submission or the response. Those were internal Vorkai documents, but the shape of it. What he had argued for. What the response had been. He wrote, "The review will take time. The outcome is not certain."
I want to be honest with you about that.
There are people in our institutional structure who will argue for the standard approach, and their arguments are not unreasonable from within the framework that has governed Vorkai expansion for 4 centuries. A framework, I want to note, that has produced real benefits for the civilizations involved. This is not a simple story, but that also has, I am now understanding, never had to answer the question your letter asked. The question of what happens when someone speaks first. Maya's response came with unusual speed, 39 minutes after transmission, barely time for the signal to reach Earth and a person to read it and write back. We have been talking about this on our end too.
The 8 billion.
What we would say if we could speak to all of them right now. We don't have an answer. It's not a small problem. But I want you to know that when we imagine it, what we imagine telling them is not what you came here to do. We imagine telling them what you chose instead. We think that's the part that matters. Please let us know what the review decides. Caro, and here, at the center of everything, was the thing that Sevorith found himself unable to fully articulate in any official document, any formal submission, any letter. The correspondence had changed him. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way of a revelation that arrived complete. In the slow, accumulative way of genuinely paying attention to something for 2 years. The way you can study a subject for decades and know it technically and then one specific afternoon actually understand it, not differently from before, but more. He understood now what the integration model had been protecting against. And he understood what it had been protecting against by protecting against. The integration model protected against resistance, against conflict, against the damage that came from 2 forces meeting without preparation. It was a real protection. The data supported it. He was not dismantling the data. But the price of that protection was exactly this. The thing that was happening in these letters. The specific quality of 2 intelligent, uncertain, genuinely trying minds meeting each other as themselves and finding, in that meeting, something that neither had expected and both needed. The integration model made that impossible by design. He had spent 40 years thinking this was a feature. He was no longer sure. The High Fleet Strategic Review took 5 months. Sevorith was not present for most of it. It occurred at the command center, 9 light hours away. He received summaries through official channels and read between the lines of the formal language in the way that career officers learn to read institutional documents, not just for what they said but for which things were said carefully and which were said quickly, where the hesitations were, where the confidence was, what the structure of the argument revealed about where the argument was headed. The review considered 3 options. The first was the standard integration pathway, proceed as originally planned, classify the correspondence as an intelligence-gathering exercise that had produced useful cultural data, and complete the operation. The argument for this was institutional consistency and the avoidance of precedent that could complicate future operations. The second was a withdrawal option, leave the solar system, classify Earth as a developmental anomaly requiring longer observation, defer the integration question indefinitely. The argument for this was risk avoidance. The Earth situation had already deviated significantly from modeled parameters, and further deviation was difficult to predict. The third was what Sevorith had argued for. No official name in the review documentation. Simply, Option 3. The review's recommendation, when it came, was Option 3. Not unanimously. The vote among the 11 senior strategic directors who comprised the review body was 7-4. The 4 dissenting votes submitted their reasoning, which Sevorith read carefully and found genuinely substantive, not simply conservative. The argument against was not about principle but about uncertainty, not whether this was the right thing but whether the right thing was achievable in practice, whether the Earth Correspondence Group represented their civilization or only themselves, whether a commitment made in letters could survive the scale of what it would need to become when 8 billion people entered the conversation. These were real questions. The recommendation, nonetheless, was proceed. The specific language of the authorization was, Commander Sevorith is authorized to initiate first direct contact with the Earth Correspondence Group, with full transparency regarding Vorkai nature and intentions, for the purpose of establishing a consensual relational framework. The operational outcome, integration, formal alliance, mutual observation agreement, or other arrangement, is to be determined through dialogue rather than predetermined. No outcome is pre-authorized or pre-excluded. The commander is instructed to proceed as the situation requires. As the situation requires. He had read that phrase 6 times. It was informal Vorkai administrative language, about as close to trust your judgment as the institutional vocabulary allowed. He wrote to Maya. The review has concluded. We are authorized to proceed. What this means in practical terms is that I would like to ask whether you, the correspondence group, would be willing to receive us. Not at a distance. In person, if that is a concept that works for you, in a location you choose, at a time you choose, with whatever conditions you determine are necessary for the safety and comfort of everyone involved. I recognize this is an enormous request. I recognize it moves the conversation from letters into something that cannot be revised or deleted before it is sent. I recognize it raises the question of the 8 billion in an immediate and practical way that the letters have allowed to remain somewhat abstract. I am asking anyway because the alternative is to not ask, and I have come to believe over 2 years that the value of asking first is not a concept I encounter from you. It is a concept I discovered in you, and it seems right to use it here. The Earth Correspondence Group met for 3 days. The arguments were real, and the room was loud, and Maya drank more coffee than she had drunk in any 3-day period of her life. General Webb sat very still and said almost nothing until the 2nd day, and then said what he had been thinking in exactly the number of words required, which was something she had noticed he was consistently capable of doing. The Day 2 argument had come down to a single question that Director Halverson articulated with her characteristic precision. Are we representing ourselves, or are we representing the world? And Ravi Patel had said, in his quiet way, looking at the ceiling, we've always been representing both. That's what letters are. One person writing on behalf of everyone they've ever been, everyone they've ever known, in a language that makes it possible for another person to understand them. We can't get 8 billion people in this room. But we can be what we are, 11 people who chose this, who stayed with it, who know what 2 years of conversation actually sounds like. And we can be that as honestly as possible. The vote was 10-1 in favor of receiving them. Thomas Reyes, who had started as the most uncertain person in the room, was the one person who had asked to abstain. Not from disagreement, he said, but because he had come to believe over 2 years that the outcome had never actually been uncertain, and he wanted to be on record as the person who said that.
The room had sat with that for a while.
Then Maya had written the response.
Yes.
We will receive you. We have been discussing location. We have chosen a place, a wide, flat plain in the interior of one of our continents. It is not a city. We chose something with open sky, which felt right for reasons we found difficult to fully articulate, but all agreed on. We will provide coordinates. We have 11 people. Bring whoever you want. Bring as many as feels right. We trust your judgment on this. You have been demonstrating good judgment for 2 years. We would like to request one thing, if it is possible. Arrive at morning. Local morning, at the coordinates we will provide. There is something about morning that feels appropriate for this. The beginning of a day, the light coming in from one direction. We will be there. The Earth Correspondence Group. Of SYMJHY. The night before the landing, Sevorith did not sleep. He sat in his quarters, and he thought about the 43 worlds. Not with guilt. Guilt was not quite the right word for what he felt, and choosing the right word mattered. Guilt implied that what was done was simply wrong, and that he was responsible for it in a way that required punishment or absolution. It was more complicated than that, and more honest to sit with the complication than to simplify it in a direction that was easier to process. What he felt was closer to weight. The weight of 43 worlds that had not been given this, that had not had their message decoded, or had not sent one, or had not been on the ship that happened to have a navigation second young enough to be curious, and not yet experienced enough to assume he knew what wasn't possible. He did not know how to carry that weight perfectly. He was not sure perfect weight carrying was available to him. He thought what he could do, what he would try to do, going forward, in whatever form this took, was to be precise about it. To not lose it in the machinery of moving forward. To let it be there, acknowledged, part of what this was. He thought about the 43 worlds, and then he thought about what was going to happen in the morning, and for a long time those two thoughts sat side by side in the dark, uncomfortably and necessarily close. The shuttle descended at dawn. Not the military shuttle, Sevorth had been specific about this. The landing vehicle was the Science Survey Shuttle, smaller, designed for surface operations rather than tactical deployment. No weapon systems, no armor plating. It looked, from the outside, more like a large smooth stone than a weapon. He had chosen this on purpose. 7 Vorkai made the landing. Sevorth, Velthara, Arokeln, the ship's philosophical officer Dr. Remsava, the biologist who had been preparing physiological safety protocols for this moment for 2 years, and 2 crew members whose primary function was technical support and who had, both of them, submitted written requests to be included. Sevorth had approved the requests. It had seemed right. As the shuttle broke through the cloud layer, the plane came into view. It was golden in the early light, flat and very wide, the grasses catching the horizontal light and turning it, and in the center of it, small from altitude, growing as they descended, 11 figures standing in an open circle, looking up. Sevorth stood at the forward viewport and felt something he could not immediately name. Then he could. It was the same thing he had felt reading the letter for the first time, but in the body rather than just in the mind. Immediate. Physical. Like a frequency his physiology was responding to before his cognition had processed it. He thought it might be the feeling of something being real that had been, for 2 years, only words. The shuttle set down 200 meters from the group and was still for a moment. Then the entry ramp extended. Sevorth went first. He walked out into the morning air of Earth, which smelled like nothing he could have predicted, complex and organic and alive in a way that no archival data captured, because scent was not something the archive had been built to collect. And he stood at the bottom of the ramp, and he looked across the golden grass at 11 people who had been looking back at him for 2 years. They were smaller than he had expected. This was a simple physiological fact. Human bipeds were physically smaller than Vorkai, and knowing this from data and seeing it in person were different experiences. He made note of this. The data told him things, and then the world showed him that the data and the thing were not identical. This was worth remembering. He began to walk toward them. They began to walk toward him. The plane was very large, and the morning light was very clear, and the grasses made a soft sound in the wind that neither side had planned for, and that everyone present, both species, would remember for the rest of their lives. Maya Chin reached him first. She was shorter than anyone else in her group. He had not noticed this from the archive footage, and she was walking fast, with the energy of someone who had spent 2 years moving toward this moment at the speed of electromagnetic signals and now had legs and was not interested in using them slowly. She stopped 3 meters from him. He stopped. They looked at each other. She was, he could see, afraid. Not hiding it. That was a human face, and human faces were more legible than any single culture's social norms could account for, and she had been writing letters that told him what her fear looked like. But she was here. She was 3 meters away, and she was here. He was also afraid. His skin had shifted to a pale amber that he was not going to manage back to gray, because this moment was not a professional context, and he had decided, somewhere on the descent, that performing professional gray here would be dishonest, and the thing between them had been built on honesty, and he was not going to undermine it at the moment of its physical realization. She looked at his skin. He had not mentioned the bioluminescence explicitly in the letters. Velthara had discussed it with Dr. Okonkwo, but in analytical terms. He had the sudden thought that she might not know what the amber meant. Then he saw the expression on her face change. Not surprise, something more than surprise. She was reading him, not knowing the vocabulary, not having the cultural key, but reading him the way someone reads a face that belongs to a language they don't speak but recognize as language. She knew what amber meant.
He didn't know how.
Maybe the same way he had known, reading the letter for the first time, that the people who wrote it were genuinely what they presented themselves to be. Some things communicated below the level of learned vocabulary. Some things were just what they were. She said in English, which he had learned over 2 years, imperfectly but sufficiently, "Hello." He said, in English, which was not his language, but which was the language they had built everything in. "Hello." Then Maya Chin did something that no one had told her to do, that was not in any protocol or plan, that came from the same place the original letter had come from, the place where things were too true to be managed. She reached out her hand. Caro and Sevorith looked at the hand, which was a greeting gesture he had studied in the archive 100 times, which he understood as an offer of physical contact that carried specific social meaning, which was extended to him across the space of 3 meters and across the distance of everything that had happened and everything that had almost happened. He reached out his upper right hand. They were built differently. Their hands were built differently. The anatomy was entirely unlike, but the gesture was the same. Open. Forward. A choice. They shook hands. What happened next was not formal and was not dramatic. They all came forward, and they stood on the golden plain in the early morning, and they talked. Not in the way of diplomats or ambassadors or the official representatives of something. They would be those things later, when what had started here needed to be given larger structure. But in the way of the correspondence. In the way of letters. Aro Kelm found Maya, somewhat nervously, half an hour in. She turned to look at him, the youngest person on either side, the one who had written to her about Sharveloth, and her face did something that took his entire translation AI capability to properly interpret and which it eventually categorized as recognition of someone already known, arriving in a new form. "You are Aro Kelm," she said. "Yes," he said. His English was careful and self-taught from the archive, slightly formal in the way of someone who learned a language from texts. "You are Dr. Chen." "Maya," she said. "In letters, I am Maya." He took a moment to process this. "Maya," he said. She smiled. He had studied human smiling in the archive and understood its basic mechanics and its broad social meaning. He understood that this particular one meant something more specific, something that fell into a category the archive labeled recognition and warmth toward a specific individual, rather than general social performance. He was Sharveloth, deeply awake to the significance of a moment too large to fully comprehend. He had written that to her. And now he was standing on a golden plain on the planet of the people who had broken his commander's model with a letter, and she had used his word back to him, and the morning was very clear. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo and Velthara walked away from the group together. Not by plan, they both drifted in the same direction and then looked at each other and continued. They walked along the edge of the grass, speaking quietly, running through the technical language of their correspondence in real time, testing whether things that worked in text worked in voice. They both found that they did, and they both found that there was something gained in voice, texture, rhythm, hesitation in the right places that text had approximated but not quite reached. 2 years of letters, Velthara said. 2 years, Okonkwo agreed. "I think I knew what you would sound like," Velthara said. "I had a model of it. In my mind. Was I right?" Velthara's skin shifted, a complex movement, amber and something softer, moving together. "The model was right," she said. "The real thing is bigger." HFY and General Webb and Sevorith found each other near the shuttle, more or less by mutual gravitational drift. Neither of them was a person who required significant amounts of social engagement in a moment of high intensity. They stood near each other for a while, without speaking, watching the grass move. Then Webb said, "You could have not sent the letter." Sevorith considered this. "Yes." "What made you?" He thought about the letter. The actual original letter, the first one, the one from Earth. He thought about reading it for the 3rd time, as a person rather than as a professional. He thought about the specific moment when it had shifted from data to something else.
"There was a line," he said.
About speaking first. About how the worst things tend to happen when no one speaks first. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I recognized it as true before I decided what to do about the fact that it was true." Webb nodded slowly. This was apparently an acceptable answer. They stood in the morning light on the golden plain of Earth. 2 people who had both spent long careers inside institutions that were not designed for exactly this, and they watched their people talk to each other, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when they are watching something good happen. The formal contact declaration took 11 months. Not because the Earth correspondence group was slow, they were, by then, the fastest-moving part of the process, but because the Vorkai institutional process required careful navigation, and the human governmental processes required even more careful navigation, and the period between the landing on the plane and the formal declaration was one of the most complex, exhausting, occasionally infuriating, and genuinely important 11 months that any of the people involved had ever experienced. The 8 billion people found out gradually. This was perhaps inevitable. The correspondence group had always known that one was not a question of if, but of how to release the information in a way that was truthful, and that gave the conversation enough structural foundation to survive the weight of global awareness. They worked with communication specialists, psychologists, and historians. They released the correspondence record, the full 73 letters, simultaneously with the announcement. Not a summary. The actual letters. So that the first thing 8 billion people encountered was not the political fact of alien contact, but the human story of 11 people in a room who had been afraid and chosen to be there anyway, and an alien commander who had received their letter and written back. This was Ravi Patel's suggestion. He had argued that people could handle enormous things better if they were given the human truth of it first, not the institutional framing, not the strategic significance, but the actual texture of what had happened. The letters, the arguments in the room, the disagreement about conditions, the night before the landing, the golden plane, the handshake. He had been right. The response was not without fear. Of course it was not without fear. It was the most significant moment in human history, and fear was a rational response. But the public conversation that followed was shaped, from its first hours, by the nature of what had been released. People did not encounter an announcement. They encountered a story. A real one, with uncertainty in it, with arguments and mistakes, and a young Vorkai officer writing about Sharveloth and a linguist in a building no one knew existed choosing to be there anyway. Stories do different things than announcements. The formal framework that emerged from the 11 months was something new. Not integration. Not alliance in the conventional military sense. Not the cold architecture of mutual observation with no real contact. The closest word that existed, in any of the 47 languages the Vorkai had catalogued, was drawn from the pre-expansion philosophical vocabulary, the old texts that Sevorith had been reading more of lately. The word was Velketh. It translated, imperfectly, as the agreement to go forward together with full knowledge of where we came from. The Vorkai High Fleet Command had approved it 7-4 in the strategic review, and then, when it was brought to the full governing council, by a margin that surprised everyone including Sevorith. The surprise was not that it passed. The correspondence record had been widely distributed internally, and the Sharveth documentation was considered landmark, but that the margin was as large as it was. Omith Vel, the strategic director, had said in her summary statement that the question being voted on was not just whether Earth entered the network, but whether the network wanted to be the kind of thing that entered into Velketh agreements, whether it wanted, going forward, to be an institution capable of that. The margin suggested the institution had an answer. The 4 who had dissented from the original review submitted a joint addendum that was added to the official record. They wrote, "We record our dissent not as opposition to this outcome, but as a permanent note for the institutional record. The positive result in this case does not retroactively validate the approach as universally applicable. Velketh requires both parties to be capable of it. The evidence of Earth's capability was exceptional, and future cases should be assessed on their own merits, not assumed to match this one. We wish for this agreement to succeed, and we believe its success depends on everyone involved remembering that it happened for specific reasons that matter." Sevorith had read this addendum several times. He found it wise. He said so, officially, in his response to the final record, that the dissent was correct, that this case did not prove a universal rule, that the 43 other worlds deserved their own honest examination, and that he was prepared to be part of that examination for as long as it took. Maya Chen did not attend the formal signing ceremony. She was invited and she declined. Not in protest. She supported everything the ceremony represented. She declined because she had a practical reason. She was in the middle of writing something. She was writing a book. The full account of the correspondence, not just the letters which were already public, but the room, the arguments, The weight of 11 people trying to speak on behalf of 8 billion. The coffee. The 3 days of decision-making before they responded to the first Vorkai letter. Thomas Reyes staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to tell him it was a drill. She wrote it because Frank Summers had asked her to, and she had initially declined, and then she had sat with the declining for a month and realized she was declining because it was enormous, and the right response to something enormous was not to leave it unwritten. She called it speaking first. Sevorith was assigned, by High Fleet Command, as the permanent liaison commander for Earth. He had not expected this. He had expected to hand the Earth situation to a diplomatic corps team and return to the work of cartographic operations, perhaps with a new operational framework and perhaps with a different relationship to that work than he'd had before. Instead, the assignment was specific: remain engaged, build. He accepted it. The enduring patience did not leave Earth's solar system for 7 years. In those 7 years, Aro Kelm became the first Vorkai officer to learn English fluently enough to conduct full diplomatic negotiations without a translation AI. He was 26 years old in Vorkai terms when he gave the first live address to a human audience, standing in a room that held 300 people who all had the same expression Maya had described once in a letter as the look of watching something impossible be real. He had prepared remarks. He delivered them competently and then set them aside and said, in clear, careful English with the slight formality of a language learned from texts, I have been Sharveloth, which in your vocabulary is something like deeply awake to a moment too large to hold, since before I landed on your planet. I want you to know I am still that. This is not, for me, ordinary. And I do not believe it should become ordinary. I think the not ordinary quality of this is something we should protect. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, it was not quiet, of SY and JHY. And here is what the 43 worlds eventually became. A question. Not a crisis, not an immediate undoing. The Vorkai were not a civilization that moved at the speed of guilt, and the humans, once they understood what integration meant, were not naive enough to expect a simple reversal of 400 years of history. But a question, put formally and seriously into the Vorkai institutional record by Sevorith, supported by Velthra, championed with specific intensity by Aro Kelm, who had grown into a diplomat of considerable skill and was not willing to hold Sharveloth only for himself. The question was, what would it look like to go back? Not to undo. Some things cannot be undone, and the pretending otherwise is dishonest. But to go back with full transparency and ask the question that was never asked. To offer the conversation that was not offered. To do, for each of those 43 worlds, what Earth asked for and what we, in a moment of institutional history that could easily have gone differently, chose to provide. This question was not resolved quickly. It was not resolved in Sevorith's active career. But it was asked. It was formally asked, in the official record, with full documentation of the Earth precedent, and it remained open and present, and asked in a way that meant it would eventually require answering. On the 7th anniversary of the landing on the plane, Maya Chen and Sevorith were both in the same city for the first time since that morning. There was an official event, dinners, speeches, the whole formal architecture of anniversary celebration, and they attended, and they were patient with it because formal architecture existed for reasons. But before the official event, early in the morning, they met on a terrace that looked out over the city and had coffee. She had coffee. He had the Vorkai equivalent which had no English name and which smelled, she had said when she first encountered it, like standing in a forest at night, and they talked the way they had always talked in letters, without performance, without formality, with the specific quality of two people who had been genuinely honest with each other for long enough that they had stopped noticing it required effort. He asked about the book. She said she was writing the second one. The first had ended at the landing. The second was about what came after. Is it harder? He asked. She considered this. The first one was harder emotionally, she said. The second one is harder, because it's still happening. Writing something while it is still happening.
Yes.
You can't see the shape of it yet. You can only write the inside of it.
He thought about this.
Maybe that is the honest form, he said. For something that doesn't have a shape yet. She looked at him over her coffee. She was older than she had been on the plane, 7 years older, which in human terms was visible, the lines slightly different, the gray in her hair that had not been there. He had thought about this sometimes, the different rates at which their bodies moved through time. The Vorkai lived longer. She would age faster in relative terms, and he would still be a relatively young commander when she was an old woman. He had thought about this, and then he had thought about the letters, and how the letters had not been diminished by the transmission delay, by the physics of the distance between them, by the fact that by the time words arrived the person who wrote them had already moved on to a different thought. The letters had still been real. The delay had been part of them, had been, in a way, part of what made them what they were. The evidence of distance overcome. Maybe time was like that too. Maybe every conversation that crossed a real difference was, in some sense, a letter sent across a delay, and what mattered was not that the delay was erased, but that the letter arrived anyway, that someone was there to receive it. "What is the second book called?" he asked. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "What comes after speaking first?" He let the title sit for a moment. "That sounds right," he said. "I think so," she said. They sat on the terrace in the early morning, above the city that was waking up, under the same sky that had once been observed from a ship that had arrived in silence and intended to remain there, and the city made its sounds below them, complex and alive, and somewhere beyond the atmosphere the enduring patience was still in its orbital position, and the question of the 43 worlds was still open in the official record. And 8 billion people knew the name Velketh, and most of them were still figuring out what it meant, which was appropriate because the people who had coined it were still figuring that out too. And on a terrace above all of it, two people drank their morning drinks in the companionable silence of people who had been honest with each other for long enough that silence was also a form of the conversation. There is a word the Vorkai use for the moment when the calculation changes. Vel-Sherith. The variable that makes the original equation not just incomplete, but, in the deep structural sense, wrong. Not wrong in its arithmetic. Wrong in its assumptions about what kind of problem was being solved. Earth had been a problem. Then it had sent a letter. And it became something else entirely, not a problem solved, not a threat neutralized, not a resource incorporated. Something that didn't have a name in the original operational protocol. Something that, over time, was given one. Velketh. The agreement to go forward together, with full knowledge of where we came from. Not a perfect agreement. Not a complete one. One that was still being written in the second book, in the official record, in the question of the 43 worlds, in the conversations happening right now in 100 different rooms on a blue planet, and aboard a ship that had arrived to do one thing and stayed to do another. Conversations. Caro, and if you asked Maya Chun years later what she believed the letter had actually done, the one they wrote in a building no one knew existed, to a ship that was not supposed to be findable, she would say this. It did not save Earth. It was not a rescue or a victory or a triumph of human ingenuity over alien power. What it did was simpler and harder and more real than any of those things. It said, "We are here." It said, "We know you are there." It said, "Before anything else happens, let's try this." And something on the other end, something that had arrived in silence, that had systems designed to prevent exactly this, that had done this 43 times without anyone having the chance to speak first. Read it. And wrote back. That was all. That was everything. And,